and welcome to the Walter Bosley channel for another really cool episode. I've been anxious to have this guest on, and as you can see him here, this is my friend James Larson, and he's a very interesting guy, a thinker, a writer. Done some acting. His dad, which will be this is a topic we'll be discussing. His dad is a guy who, you know, created one of the great TV shows of all time. And we're going to talk about that and related things. So, James Larson, welcome to the Walter Bosley channel.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on the Walter Bosley channel. It is a true pleasure. And I loved watching you talk about the opening because I always think it's fascinating how to frame anything. And that's something I learned from my father. He was a little old school, he did television before The Sopranos and before, there was a different thing. There was a different kind of discipline. So like a lot of good cheesy stuff from the 80s. But of all the things that he taught me or left to me as a legacy, it would be the ideas that he had from his writing and the way that he had certain beliefs. And then he was able to share that with the American people. So my name is James A. Larson. My father was Glenn A. Larson. And he started out as a musician doing doo-wop music and fun stuff like that. And he segued into being a television writer. And I think he worked, one of his first gigs was It Takes a Thief with Robert Wagner.
Huh.
And then he would move on and move up that ladder in television. It's very inverted from the cinema world. We were joking the other day about writers, right? Writers are not always respected in Hollywood. It's a little different in television versus the cinema. I think the Flintstones movie famously had like 50 credited writers with the Writers Guild of America that were on that movie.
That's insane.
So it's very, but you'll notice one of the cool saving graces of television has been like Rod Serling, we mentioned. He's one of my heroes. In television, the writer, and it's almost like a holdout from radio, but the writer is supreme, and the directors are like the guy that come in and out of a season.
Mm-hmm.
And the ultimate head writer is usually the creator. Now, we talk about auteurs and leaving a legacy. My dad it was a little bit different of a time, so he would write the first episode of a television series is called a pilot.
Yep.
And he would write pilots and then get them made, and then he'd keep making those. So he'd create a show and then like a startup company hand it off to different people. So a great example would be Magnum PI, like did the pilot, and then would hand that off to different showrunners. Whereas sometimes now we think of them as always being with the entire continuity of the show. So he went in and then he started to do his own shows, and I guess we'll talk about the one which has the most interesting background, and that's Battlestar Galactica. Walter, what do you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one that is still popular and relevant to this day. The remake a few years ago was very popular, had a big following, but the original is loved by, I was in junior high, I think, when in 1978. No, I had started high school. I think I was a sophomore when Battlestar Galactica appeared, and I didn't miss an episode that first season.
Well, speaking, well, first season is the key word there. Like, there's been three great, like Star Trek only had a couple seasons, right? Twilight Zone only had a couple seasons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Battlestar would be replaced by Mork and Mindy. But that's the thing, is that they were trying to pull off the logistics of Star Wars, but in a television season where you had to do 22 episodes. That's why they would go to some weird planet where they're, and you have adventures there. Um, they had, that was the brutal reality is trying to make things work. So
Right.
very expensive. Even Star Wars, the that sort of filmmaking was being, innovating at the time with John Dykstra, who literally went from Star Wars to working on Battlestar. And there's a lot of esoteric roots to it, Walter, which is the reason I love to bring it up with you.
Right.
Um, it 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 had a thing. I made a video about it, but I don't know if I was able to get it to you. It's it like I think the original master file is like 2 gigs or something, but I should put it onto YouTube or get it to you later.
Yeah,
But
you could give me the link and I could gladly share that.
right. But it's an interview with him and the Academy, and he's sort of doing a retrospective on why he started. And for him, he was talking about the theological origins and the ancient Egyptians, and that brings me to so there was going to be a season 2, my friend, and the great Isaac Asimov was going to be a consultant on that second season
Wow. Yeah.
had it went on to exist. Now, my father told me that he had this kind of famous disagreement, a very vigorous disagreement between him and Isaac Asimov over
Hmm.
the Great Pyramid of Giza.
Really? Okay.
What do you think Isaac Asimov's take on it was, and what do you think my father's was? And I know that's being very general, but
I would say that I don't know if I had to wild ass guess, I'd say Asimov would have leaned more towards being the more grounded in what he thought was, archaeology and science, and your dad
100% correct.
more open minded. The way
My
we are.
father thought it was the legacy of a mother civilization
There you go.
that had since vanished,
Yeah.
leaving only traces behind. So it's just interesting, like to hear like a story like that. I'm not like, I'm a huge science fiction fan. But there was a time, sometimes if you've ever met, certain sci-fi artists, there's some of them are very literal, very,
Hmm.
but it's a wide gamut. But it's interesting. So that was, the Eric von Daniken was writing, and I think in the 70s, right? So my
Yes.
father, I think I knew,
60s.
watched episodes of his or read those books, and he grew up with the Latter-day Saints or Mormon background, and so he brought a little bit of that, a little bit of Catholicism too, a little bit of a pastiche of different things.
Hmm.
And well, let's see if I should try to find the video because the video might lay it out better. But the
Yeah.
idea is it starts with a false flag. The
Okay.
initial pilot has basically a 9/11 or a Pearl Harbor type event
Mm.
that's existential. And that basically launches into the pilot and the thrust of the show.
Right.
Now, here's another famous thing. My father didn't want them to discover the Earth, and they did at the end of the season. And there was a big, I think it's a network. The network is like, oh, you know what? They ought to find the Earth.
Yeah, because it makes it easier for them to do future seasons, which
My
we
dad
saw.
says, like, well, then the show's over.
Yeah,
You're like,
Galactica
yeah.
1980 was the result of that.
Oh, brother, that's something.
Yeah.
Now I have to like, say 3 prayers and hold a rosary. No, no, exactly. No, that's what happens when the networks, get in and by the way, they do that.
Oh yeah,
It's very very
sure.
scary.
Yeah.
But it was a great legacy, and I think it was like a baby to him because he got to just. Here's one of the things he said: the hardest thing that he always struggled with was to not have these like things that he says he didn't want to have it look like they have a broom like we have a broom, that the very origins of our things.
Hmm.
And one of the critiques he had about the reboot, I think Ron Moore, um, is that he had somebody, my dad, and I'll use his words. He's like, you have a guy in a Brooks Brothers suit there, like, it's too. He thought it was too easy, that
Sure.
you had to rebuild like the whole art direction, like it was Lord of the Rings. But again,
Yeah.
television.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that
So,
was the Baltar character. You're the new
but
the redo
yeah.
on Baltar, right?
Well,
Was
the
in the
big
suit.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And the biggest change, of course, I think, would be Starbuck.
Yeah.
Starbuck going from the cigar chomping ladies' man, sort of a 007 figure,
Hmm.
um, that archetype. And then, of course, he becomes a very voluptuous blonde woman. Very different,
Yeah.
very different. Keeping with the times, I suppose. But once you get used to it, I read the manifesto that Ron Moore wrote
Hmm.
before it ever got created. And he had this like edgy, he's like, space is a vacuum. So we don't have any music, no explosions, nothing. It's like, and
Hey.
I watched the first takes, like, and it's like it just wasn't dramatic. Like maybe it's a good idea philosophically to,
Hmm.
in space it's a vacuum, but then they ended up doing tribal drums or something. What the weird thing is they didn't have the iconic theme,
Right.
and my dad wrote that theme song with Stu Phillips, who's his arranger, same person
Okay.
he wrote Knight Rider with.
Yeah.
Um, and John, my dad says that one of the greatest moments of his entire life was John Williams with one of these symphony orchestras did the Battlestar theme to close out some Fourth of July summer show, and it was just
Cool.
beautiful, and it was like dun 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 dun
Yeah.
dun,
Oh, I could imagine with
Yeah.
Williams.
And same thing when they remade Knight Rider. What I think it was Ben Silverman at NBC, and Val Kilmer, who recently passed away, was doing the voice of Kit. They didn't have the iconic theme, and it was bizarre because it's not all the time that it becomes iconic. Where it's hard to think of Knight Rider without like that.
Hmm.
Dun, 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 dun. It had this '80s kind of retro thing, but there's all these hip hop people that have sampled that Knight Rider theme.
Well, there's this thing that the writers have that they want to make something their own. Now,
Yes.
if it's not something that's so familiar and wasn't like a big hit before that is not familiar to the public, okay, that's fine because maybe what you're the part you're bringing and the part that you're adapting or whatever, it's a good blend and it'll become that iconic thing. But when you're talking about something that was around before and is known, I mean,
Yeah.
use the theme, but they did the same thing with Star Trek. Each show got its own theme song. So,
I know. Like, listen, if I were a tech wizard, or like in the future, maybe, because I'm going to learn this app, my friend,
mhm.
then I could just go right to like some, like, well, let's let them know what we're talking about, and we could play that little Knight Rider theme.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, you're right. No, it'd be like we're gonna do Indiana Jones, but you don't do the Indiana Jones. People.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, right. Like I'm not saying in all cases, but like if you did Indiana Jones, so it's a little bit like. And I'm glad, by the way, when they redid Blade Runner, with I think it was Ryan Gosling.
Yeah.
God, just that's such a rich universe build. From do you remember the original soundtrack by Vangelis in the
Oh God,
80s? And it
yeah.
was
I
like,
listened to it over and over and
and it
over
and
again
it's
back
Los
then.
Angeles.
Yeah.
I think there's like when you're in Los Angeles, you notice like in every disaster movie, like they destroy Los Angeles. So John Cusack in 2012, he's
Mhm.
literally at the Santa Monica airport. Do you think it's like some sort of a like it's the collective guilt of the industry or the nation, the decadence, like so we keep telling ourselves these apocalyptic stories,
Yeah.
or do we feel because Battlestar is an apocalyptic story?
In a way, yeah, it
It
is.
started out the original idea was about a Howard Hughes character
Hmm.
who so today for the young kids that would be Elon Musk.
Hmm.
Howard Hughes was like a ladies' man. He made movies. He
Yep.
built airplanes. He dated starlets and just a kind of singular, once in a century character.
Hmm.
And this Howard Hughes character, so it'd be Elon Musk now, has like a bunch of fancy computers, and they've done all this predictive analytics, and they know that a cataclysm is finally coming around again.
Yeah.
And so he needs to take a saving remnant of the population So he invites all of these people to a party, ostensibly, and they're the creme of the creme, like from all parts of society. And at one point, they're in this what they think is a skyscraper or something, but it's a starship that takes off into the space. The Earth
Hmm.
is destroyed.
Okay.
So he ended up, because you have to pitch this as a show. So this would be our regular Star Trek, just going out there and exploring, like
Right.
But he loved this TV show called Wagon Train,
Oh yeah.
and so he would always say it was about the journey. That's why he didn't want them to find Earth. So
Hmm.
he flipped it. So instead of going out there, they were going to find a mythical Earth. And then this is what allowed him to think, if there was a legacy civilization, Walter, that preceded us, that something happened to it, and we are sort of a species with amnesia, and we don't know our own past or what our own
Right.
direction is. And so he just reverses it, and there are people who have to leave their planet after it's destroyed,
Hmm.
and then they're looking for Earth. But to them, it's like Atlantis. Some of them think it's mythical.
Right.
Some people don't believe, and so you have a lot of adventures. You can visit planets, and then you can share a little bit of whether you want to call it theology, wisdom. But the challenge is when you're trying to think of other worlds, you're trying to think of what um, makes us common. When Joseph Farrell says we might have cousins out there,
Yes.
I love that he uses that term, cousins.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, like what
Yeah,
would you,
I think that there's humans exactly like us that are, start on other planets. I find it ridiculous when, people try to say, oh no, it's impossible. There can't be humans like us, originating, or from other worlds, it can only be here. I'm like, well, until scientists go to every planet, every habitable planet in the universe and not find a single human, they can't say that. It's just ridiculous. And we exist, so we're an example of very much what could exist out there. So I've had the discussion with Joseph Farrell on this very thing many times into the wee hours of the morning, and we're on the same page with that. We think there's humans out there just like us.
yeah, absolutely. Well, think of all the internal prejudice, the different. One of my favorite books is Structures of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and it's a philosophy of science book. And it argues that if you look at all the way that new science or cutting edge or something that changes the paradigm, and he coined the word paradigm. He says that sometimes for a new truth or a new scientific paradigm to take over, the old guard literally has to die off.
Mm,
That it's not that they're not just compelled by the argument, so to speak, but that it's so where we are now, like for instance, in the physics research community, it's like Moses in the wilderness for 40 years, and there's a reason for that, right?
mm,
Um, I don't know if you know how this ties into, but it was recently disclosed that I think during the Biden regime and administration, um, that there was a discussion where somebody says, if you want, we can make that mathematics or any derivative thereof a state secret. I'll have to find the article, but basically, this is this was an admission of something that we've come to suspect in other contexts. Like in 1959 was a prominent year that a lot of science went black.
oh yeah.
The famous thing, Oliver Heaviside modified Maxwell's equations.
Yep.
And so he's just an interesting guy if you get into that. And so, but this was the most transparent expression of this.
Hmm.
And they said at the mathematical level, like we'll make that mathematics like no go. And
Hmm.
so when you think about string theory in physics or some of these things, the M theory, and people wander in the wilderness with these things, as I think they have with relativity, by the way. It might be controversial, but there was um there was obviously some greater understanding of electromagnetics that sort of after World War II
Yeah.
was determined to be something like the what was it, Townsend Brown?
T.
He,
Townsend Brown, he was,
he went to go do stuff for the Navy, right? And
yeah, anti-gravity type research, and that stuff was open source. It was very publicly, out there. And then in 1958, suddenly a lid was clamped down on
yeah, there were two
anti-gravity.
parallel programs. And he thought at one point he was like being edged out of one. There was one with continuity from, I think he did his work with the Eldridge or whatever in like 43. And
Mm-hmm.
there was like this paperwork in the Navy to, like he said he was having a nervous breakdown. Anyway, he goes off to California. He goes to Burbank of all places,
Yeah.
which is kind of funny. He says, I was just in Burbank the other day. So, and I think doing a lot of interesting stuff. But later on, like he creates a company called Whitehall something, and he takes out a few patents. And but meanwhile, there's this parallel program that's gone on, and it's interesting because that ties in. But they found a way to get a lot more thrust than you could through traditional propulsion just by using voltage
Mm-hmm.
in a certain way. And it's amazing that more people don't discuss this. But
Well, when you
but
consider that it, like you mentioned, Oliver Heaviside, I write about him in my book Origin, about the breakaway civilizations,
mhm.
in a few of my books, I've explored this idea that by the 1890s we were headed in a particular direction that we would have had a completely, significantly different 20th century. I would argue that it would have been better and more advanced technologically, and to the benefit of civilization. And that was a period similar to 1958, where there, Oliver Heaviside with his GEM, gravitio electro, gravity electromagnetics is something like that. The book's right here, but I'm
Right.
dig for the
I was
page.
just reading Paul LaViollette's book, on
Yeah.
electrogravitics, and it's like there's so much that's just out there. Brilliant guy, like the way he's breaking it down.
Yeah, but
And
it was diverted, and so we're told that, and not to take anything away from the Wright brothers, but we're told, oh my God, that
right.
the greatest. It's like, okay, there were people doing what they did before them, and we were actually on a course that would have been something so much more incredible and spectacular than the Wright Flyer. And if you look at closely at all this stuff, there's
Yeah.
no denying it, but that's the direction they wanted us to go, is the one we were steered to. And then, again, by 1958, the post World War II era, we're heading back to, this potential amazing, fantastic world of, sci-fi reality. And they clamp that lid down, and, no, no, no,
No, no, no.
your cars are going to stay with the combustion engine, and your
Well, speaking of
airplane.
which, what do you make of that? Let's say petroleum is a moneymaker,
Yeah.
right? And also with the correlation with population growth,
Mm-hmm.
human society just goes like peaks in terms of our population boom,
Mm-hmm.
and petroleum just changes the world, and then like everything happens around the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
Like World War One is almost a little bit like maybe the last war where there was some remnant left of, war is never chivalrous. In my opinion, it's just industrial murder.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a sense that things change when you scale up too much.
Oh yeah.
So World War One,
Stakes are higher.
it's like after that, everybody should have had this pathos they reflected on, never to want to revisit it. And then World War II, I don't think there's anything that we've ever witnessed. And we should all consider ourselves lucky in a way that we um, have not experienced total full war. for whatever reason, whether it's part of actual policy but if we call them small limited wars, and
Mm.
they're all terrible, but it would be another league entirely if we had a true existential, if every citizen in the United States, felt there could be bombs falling at any time. So it's one of those World War II is one of those, or any war will change the civilization, the nature of it. And I think it's scary because it's like opening up a little bit of the shadow,
Yeah.
our shadow self, like in a Jungian way.
Hmm.
Um, would if not for a World War II, would we have things like an MK Ultra or, subsequent?
Those are the kinds of things that the roots go back to prior to World War
Really?
II. So we would, unfortunately, we'd have some version of it, but uh, you know, um, I think I've not been a big fan of the of dystopian science fiction, for example. Because I'm just old enough to remember that I don't want to say utopian because I think utopian is naive, but that positive promise, the promise of the future, that theme being in science fiction, for example. And the dystopian thing came along and just really gripped a couple of generations in a row. And so now, the more positive science fiction, like the original Star Trek, is looked upon
True.
by those generations as kind of naive. But the
Star
thing
Trek
is,
had a built-in, um,
we need that back though. we
yeah,
we need to be able to say, you know what, we learn from our mistakes when we go out there, off this planet. We remember our mistakes, we learn from them, we will do our best to not make those same mistakes. But you know what, the stars are out there, and I think it's human destiny to leave this planet. I'm not one of those that thinks, well, we should just stay here and
you and Elon Musk, you
yeah.
know.
Well, I got to tell you again, I'm in that generation where when I watch the rockets come down and landing on that column of fire, oh my, yeah, that's thrilling because again, I'm just old enough that that's stuff you'd see in science fiction, movies, TV, comic books, and stuff. And here it is, somebody is making that real. And so I'd kind of like to, see the promise, the positive out view of science fiction return. And
No,
why
I
is this
understand.
important? Because it's the mythology that influences a society.
Right. Well, I think of the book 1984, which might technically be like a dystopian science fiction, very powerful
Yes.
book.
Yeah.
And, I think in the last sentence, and he loved Big Brother,
Yeah.
because it's like, if you can't beat him, then join him or
Yeah.
anyway, but it was very beautiful. I think the first chapter ends by him taking the step of writing in a journal, which is an illegal act. Like,
Yeah.
he's and it's a metaphor for Orwell writing 1984.
Uh-huh.
And then, it's his last thing, and then he dies. And, he saw a lot of war. He was there, I think, commenting on what was happening in Spain.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, Spain is where Otto Skorzeny set up camp,
Mm-hmm.
with QJ Win, and which that was ended up being Spain. And that post-war, you know, Reinhard Galen, the Texas defense contractors, but Skorzeny and all of
Mm-hmm.
these characters, and that's almost like one of these movies, where like the rise of this technocratic neo-feudalism almost.
Mm-hmm.
I literally I see them with jackboots, like the iconography that we saw in Star Wars with the remember, like the good guys are this ragtag, we cuddle with
Yeah.
Ewoks, but they're like, militant, and they represent. When I look at it now, it's very much like what the empire that we live in and that we represent.
Yeah.
And I just I think our culture, and like, so you were saying you love those stories that are not jaded. I think it's important that we tell our stories. That's why the JFK story resonates, because JFK represents that positive, we can talk it out with, we all breathe the same air,
Yep.
we're all in the same ship, right? And then, but
Yeah.
then he's taken out, and so it's almost like that idealism cut short. And
Oh, of
so,
course, and I think that was on purpose. I mean, we could have a whole other discussion and do a show on, what I see in that uh, is the post-war influence of the Nazi scientists and other
yeah,
influences that we absorbed into this country through Operation Paperclip, which, by the way, was the idea of the Germans before the end of the war. The German aviation medicine scientists. A lot of people think Operation Paperclip was all about just the bomb. No, it was about aviation medicine scientists. Why is that important? Because aviation medicine scientists are the ones who keep human beings alive at high altitude and space. And it was their dream from the 1920s on to put man in space. And that's how these guys knew each other. And this was the angle and theme that they used on Colonel Harry Armstrong and other members of the U.S. Army Air Corps in Heidelberg.
nice. I
Say,
didn't know
hey,
this is like a
yeah, it's
this
like,
is
hey, bring us a bunch of us over and we'll work for America. And they ended up being the real in
right. What about Hans Kammler too?
all of the, well, yeah, we probably did get the bell. Look at Kecksburg,
Yeah. No,
Kecksburg
I mean there
was
was a guy
the
that
bell.
talked about working with him. I don't know where he went or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a yeah, no, they were a formidable force. It was much larger than I think has been told. People think it's just like a few people. It's
Yeah.
a lot. And in fact, if you look at New Mexico today, it's got the most German immigrants than any other state in the Union.
And what was in New Mexico? All
Uh,
the secret bases, Trinity and the rocket engineers and all that. It's
all that, yeah.
I've come to be convinced that basically Operation Paperclip was a Trojan horse. We were invaded by an enemy we thought we had vanquished, and what they did was they just slid in and started getting their talons in us. And the assassination of JFK was the coup that
Yeah.
allowed them to really take operative control of the United States through our military industrial complex, through lobbying and stuff like that. And, we've been under, their control because
Yeah.
this
Jack
country
Ruby
got
literally said
way
that.
different after World War II in some.
Jack Ruby said something to when the cameras were on him when he was being taken to or fro from one of his trials. He's like, "We're
Mhm.
gonna be, like you don't understand. We're gonna be controlled by a fascist
Yep.
government now."
And
What's he talking about?
we've got a fascist influence, going on right now. And but we had the Marxist influence before. It's right now everything's nutty because we got people pulling the pendulum way over to their own
That's
side, and then
yeah.
it
I think you're
swings
right.
clear too far.
I
You know?
here I use this as an example to show like how to how counterintuitive things might be.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say I'm a fixer or an operative for, let's say, MAGA or like the conservatives, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So I decide I'm going to go down to Dixie and I'm going to find some little town. And what
Yep.
do I do? I see a town that's perfect, for trouble, big trouble with a
Mm-hmm.
capital T that rhymes with P. Okay. So then here's what I do. I'm like, I'm going to have um, transvestite storytelling hour. We're gonna like we'll hire some people to like be really into it, and then we'll get some people to protest it. We'll get people to talk about
Yeah,
it in the
you'll get
news.
them to
We'll
go against
amplify
each
it,
other, right?
and then next thing you know, like the Ben Shapiro on the Daily Wires. This is a travesty. Look what's happening down in our little city in Tennessee. Like, can you believe this? And like it's just like over the top. Because you've
Yeah.
created it. So like this is like the counterintuitive way of doing an operation because what you're counting on is the blowback.
Yeah.
It's not what you're doing. It's like it gets talked about, And then there's a backlash, and like, can you believe it? They've gone too far. Like, can you, like, what, like, right
Yeah.
here,
And they keep the
like,
pendulum going just way,
right? And then
it
you
doesn't
take
stay
over.
in the
So that
middle.
happened in Virginia with, like, with, and then the guy took the governorship, a year later.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it wasn't based on things that were genuine. If you were cynical, but I just think like a storyteller, like, would it work in a screenplay? That's all I care about.
Yeah.
But it's a good way of like testing out hypotheticals. Um, like how much of anything that we witness can we, how much of it is just there's some trust that we have to give to the news station, to, whoever. Unless there's boots on the ground, how do we know? That's like a theme in 1984. We've always been at war with East Asia. Now, if he changes that, they redact the past. So
Mhm.
how do we know? How do we know what's above the ionosphere? How do we know there's a trust? And then if you undermine that trust in society within scientific institutions, like what happened during COVID,
Mhm.
then you'll have, so there's the backlash to all the cover-ups would be the proliferation of theories that if you were like Cass Sunstein, you do cognitive infiltration, you could introduce some flat earth and like black goo, you know, you'll
Yeah.
let's say, let's sign that guy from Blink 182. I like the cut of his jib. No,
Yeah.
I'm joking. I'm joking. What if it was that cynical though? No, but like, what would you do? Like, we live in an information ecosystem, and
Yeah.
how do we know what footage we're getting from Ukraine is, how do we know?
True, true, and that's a good exercise. Like before, I like to say, before I went to Paris, um, how do I know that the Eiffel Tower actually existed? Right, because all I saw, TV, movies, picture books. Then I go to Paris, it's like, okay, yeah, I can trust the TV, the movie, and the picture books. And recently, I forget which country sent their probe over the moon, and there were the Apollo 11 landers there on the ground, proving to the doubters, that yes, we did go to the moon, and yes, we went with that technology. But this brings it back around to T. Townsend Brown. I think we went to the moon, um, with the Apollo program, but there was a portion of the technology involved that they still haven't told us about, I think,
Right.
to enhance and just make that work, even better. And I think Apollo 11 was not the first time we actually landed. I mean, it's the Cold War dog and pony show. The whole world's watching, and we're really going to send three men up there for the first time and hadn't done this. That's not the way the U.S.
I had
government
one of the
works.
best screenplay ideas was like,
I think we landed first to make sure we
yeah,
could do it before we put on the Apollo 11 show.
yeah, it's tough to know with that one. Like, if you were just, I try to think about things from the other perspective. Like, to say I'm Nixon, I'm like, what if
Mm-hmm.
they die?
Yeah. Well,
I don't know. What if this,
he had the
like,
speech
this would be a
prepared if that
terrible
happened.
moment if I'm on the phone and they're all dead. Like,
Yeah.
like, tell you what, just go shoot some version just to have in the box, have in the can. Because, I think before the first cosmonaut, you do a little further digging into Russian history. Like, they sent a few other guys that didn't survive,
Mm-hmm.
poor Yuri, or I
Yeah.
don't
Oh,
know what,
yeah.
they said, like, yes, we sent AIDS.
There's allegedly,
Cosmonauts.
reportedly or whatever. There's allegedly recordings out there of one of their astronauts dying in reentry when
Oh my
the
gosh.
when the shield didn't work. Yeah.
Oh my
Now I don't
gosh.
know if that's like that recording of the voices in hell. Hell being a complete
It's a good
fabrication
found
by the
footage
evil
movie, like the
church
Blair Witch, but
fanatics.
some guys like falling, and it's just about his descent. Maybe he falls in Siberia,
Yeah,
and then just a
that one always
KGB
got me
agent
that they
just
land on the
shoots him
ground.
in the head. I think that's the ending. Just terrible. No, but by the way, the Russians, in case Americans always forget this,
Uh-huh.
because no, literally Americans are just like, oh, Russia, they don't know what they're doing. It's like remember in the space race, like they were first, like at
Mhm.
everything, first at everything, first,
Yeah, their rockets
put
worked.
things on the moon, first everything
Hmm.
until Apollo 11, and then, we could take a bow, I guess. But
Yeah, and that's another thing. The Soviets said it. They're Russians now. They've said it. If we had faked that, believe me, they would have spilled those beans to put egg on our face and humiliate us and show us to be liars. They were following to the extent they could, and they know we landed on the moon up there. To me, the secret is they didn't tell us about everything they found up there, and there was a little bit of extra technology that we didn't know about. And like I said, I think
that's the
we
wild card.
landed before 11.
That's the wild card is the technology. Because first of all, that's something that JFK was alluding to in some of those memos. And if you think about the timing too, this is right when everything would, all those prototypes that would have been ready.
Mm-hmm.
And when Keel is writing, he's writing like about his prime years were like 1966, 67, and he's talking about things. And so there was, yeah, there's a whole trail back to 1947.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the wild card. Some Nazis went to the Russians, some went,
Yeah.
and then there's the idea of a third, the like some syndicate,
Breakaway.
um, the breakaway, right?
Yeah,
And
the Nazi International, as Joseph Farrell
right.
calls it.
There's never been a good name for it. It's almost like
Well, I've
that.
given it one, and it comes from Charles Delschow in the 1890s, and it's the word he said. This was the German organization that was it was
Yeah.
based in Berlin or Brandenburg, and he said it was the German organization that was kind of
Ich
the
bin ein
sponsor.
Berliner.
Yeah, the sponsor of the airship guys in the
Mhm.
1850s, and it was called NIMZA and NYMZA. And I've been pulling threads on that, written a book
What if
about
that's what Trump was really trying to tell us with the
maybe
YMCA dance? We just never put it
NYMZA.
together,
Yeah, yeah.
like we
So
we
to,
never
to
got it
jump
right.
to jump
Yeah, sorry.
tracks to jump tracks again. Um, where would your dad have taken season two if there had been a season two?
Wouldn't have landed on the moon. And I think um it would, it just would have continued on in a Homeric journey, with different
Adventures and
different adventures along the way, right? He said it was always about the journey, not about the destination.
uh-huh.
Now today when we think about, if we ever had like our own beautiful show, Walter, and like we'd think of the arcs and stuff like, how
Yeah.
did they put together Breaking Bad or,
Hmm.
um, the hardest thing is to land it, you know,
Yeah.
very hard. Game of Thrones maybe didn't do it right. Lost, I think Breaking Bad did good. But how do you land it? And, do you remember the show 24? I loved it, like Jack
Yes.
Bauer.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to meet the some of the creators behind that show. And I said to him, like, "Oh my gosh, like the plotting is so amazing." I'm like, "How do you guys like do you have a Bible? Like how do you know?" And they're like, "Brother, we have no idea what's going to happen next
I
two
love
weeks
it.
out from
I
the
love it.
television time that you're watching. We have no idea.
I
We're
love it.
making it up as we go along." I'm like, "Come on, no." And they're like, "Well, we tried. Like at the beginning, we've got like 5 episodes, and then we have some ideas like, at some point,
Sure.
a nuke blows up and like, he's parachuting away. We have ideas, but we
Kind
don't
of
know
a
how to get
general
there. We'd have a general thing." I'm
direction.
like, "Are you making this up?" And then like then you find out, and then I was allowed to visit the set.
Uh-huh.
This was like holy, it'd be like going to a cathedral for a,
Right.
very
Yeah.
for a very good Catholic, and they didn't have me sign any waivers. It was like one of the most. The show's been a long, so I'm not going to give anything up. But like the key president through most of is assassinated. And the very scene, they give me headphones like I'm wearing now, and I sit in the director's chair and I'm just watching. They're like action, and they've got two Panavision cameras like on steady cams, like because it's all they have multiple
Right.
frames,
Yeah.
and so they get everything from like two angles. And this was from season 5, which won the Emmy.
Uh-huh.
And it just I love that show so much, but they didn't know what they were doing like ahead of time. And I just remember that, and also in, let's say, the 1800s, like Charles, my favorite, one of my favorite books, The Count of Monte Cristo, was
Oh,
written that way, like
yes.
in serial
Absolutely.
installments,
Yeah.
almost like if you had a blog, and then like you're just, and let's like, or you're doing one of those old serials, like where you have a cliffhanger at the end, like will
Sure.
he survive, the alligators that he's, swinging over like Tarzan. But they would just write him into a corner and pick it up from there. But they had a group to help think of ideas like
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
So,
Now you did some acting when you were younger. What all did you appear in?
oh, when I was like really young, I when I first moved to LA, I started audition like after a bit, and did like some student film, and then I got cast on LA Law with like Susan Day. I played the retarded he's the janitor, I guess, at the law firm.
Okay.
And I'm like this street kid, and that he takes in, and I'm a ne'er-do-well, and that was fun. Then I did Major Dad. I played like this boyfriend of the middle girl,
Okay.
some sitcom about a Marine.
Oh, I remember
Like,
that. Yeah.
yeah, like I was like abused, but it was one of those episodes where they had to like, if you know anybody that's been abused, don't not say anything, call this number.
Oh yeah, that was one of those very special episodes that they have on comedies,
Yeah, never seen it.
They go
Later on, I did
serious.
stuff I don't like. I did
Yeah.
this terrible soap opera on MTV that is just terrible. And I was always more of an intellectual, though, and um I was remember doing an episode of Undressed. This, it was this terrible, terrible TV show. And I remember like wanting to like be behind, like at the same time that show West Wing was on, that Aaron
Yeah.
Sorkin wrote, and I'm like, oh, that's where it's at, like.
Mm.
That level of I don't know if it's if your dad's a doctor, maybe you become a doctor, you're more likely, or you have a little understanding of what it's like.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, you just, so for me it was television, and I loved and I still love it. And, it's changing all the time, Walter. That's the thing. And
Yeah.
like um we're like things are changing, media is changing. I remember when 3D televisions were coming out and Avatar was a thing, and there was a
Mhm.
moment there to pioneer like 3D content,
Yeah.
but there was nothing. It was like a desert. It was just like exports on a couple channels, and
Hmm.
the moment passed, and it hasn't been resurrected. But there was a moment there where I wanted to write the first 3D like drama, and I
Yeah.
thought it'd be cool to do like a Twilight Zone, like an anthology
Oh, that would
that
be.
took advantage, like the Black Mirror or something, and you just had these cool which goes back to like amazing stories. Like, remember when Spielberg tried to do that based on like those pulp magazines from like the Ray Palmer, remember all those books that brought in like the UFO stories to millions of Americans.
Yeah. Yeah. The Richard Shaver stuff, and then there's a guy, I don't know
The
if you
Daros, the robots,
Daros the Taros, and if you've read have you read Gray Barker's They Knew Too Much
yeah,
About Flying Saucers? That's a
yeah.
classic. That was the first spooky UFOs are spooky. There's something weird going on. And then I read John Keel's Mothman Prophecies because I lived in that area.
No, really?
Yeah, I
I
was
know he makes
living
it.
in Mineral Wells when Woody Dernberger had his encounter with Indrid Cold. I was living right there, um,
I know
about
the
300
government
yards
has a
from where it
lot of
happened.
secret weird stuff there, like continuity of government, like, or like
Yeah,
places like, like those headquarters if some nuclear event happens.
yeah,
But I've always wondered about like the when Keel talks about like creatures, like it's interesting. I mean,
the
I haven't seen one,
interdimensionals.
but
Ultra
yeah.
terrestrials is the yeah. I think that to me, ETs. I personally accept that ETs exist. Civilization exist on other planets. Okay, so what? I'm more interested in the interdimensional element, the ultra terrestrials, those who come from the spaces in between. To me, that's much more interesting because they've been here interacting with us even more than extraterrestrials, and yet the extraterrestrial narrative is constantly pushed, and I think that's because
My
they
dad was part of the
don't want us
propaganda.
thinking
I
about things.
apologize.
Oh no, no, no!
No,
In
it's a
entertainment,
true
it's
story though.
fun,
Like I had this mentor from DARPA, and he said
Yeah,
something like, your dad was critical in bringing like the idea of reptilians like into a major platform. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, like he's all about because in the original, the Cylons were created by this reptilian race.
uh-huh.
It's funny, and like it's just you never think about that. And they changed it like in the reboot, so it's more like the Terminator, like where we create our own
Yeah.
thing. And but like it's remember like the reptil. I know a few girls from online that take this reptilian mythos very seriously,
Yeah.
and it's just interesting. But like the like there's these archetypes of these different. There's a whole cottage industry, aren't there? And like the blue avians and
Oh well, yeah.
there's the big
The whole Corey Good thing that
core
fell
good,
apart
yeah.
because it was all a lie. It was a big fantasy and a lie, and he went nuts and started suing everybody left and right just because they said I don't believe this, and then admitted in a court of law that it was a bunch of BS. And but that was a big thing for about 5 years, and he didn't even originate the blue avian thing. Technically, that was a lady who had been talking about that for a few years, and it gets data mined, and that's another thing, in this whether it's entertainment or whether it's the weird conspiracy world that we're
Yeah.
both a part of, ufology and stuff. There's the data mining,
Reminds me of the aviary. Wasn't that a
stealing from
group
everybody
that
else.
studied this stuff? So it's supposed to be from intelligence backgrounds or something. They were
Well,
called the
that's another
aviary.
thing that was whipped up to fool people. The aviary was turned out to be
Yeah, and they put
Richard
names on.
Doty, and
Right.
I think Putoff was one of them.
Oh, really?
Not Putoff, but yeah. So there's all sorts of it's difficult kind of to be in the field I'm in because I I don't like to say believer. I accept that there's life on other worlds. I accept that there's ghosts. I accept the concepts, but there are so many liars and fakers
Right.
that just are in this community. And unfortunately, because human nature is people want to hear the wild stories, the liars and fakers unfortunately get most of the attention for whatever period of time they're on the stage until finally people realize they're full of crap, and then they're replaced by another liar and faker. And that's the problem, is they put things out there that characterize the discussion of these topics in a negative way, and sometimes that's on purpose. I think that kind of thing's been going on, manipulating the narrative by Lou Elizondo and all that stuff that emerged in 2017.
Right.
That's just a perception management operation because they want us thinking about the ET narrative and nothing else, and they're pushing a threat narrative. And there's an irony there, James,
Yeah,
because
exactly. The threat narrative,
the
right?
threat narrative is a manipulation as they're using it, but I don't for 5 minutes follow this ridiculous, childish, naive notion that just because a civilization has figured out space travel, that they're peaceful all of a sudden. It
Yeah.
magically makes them benign and space brother angels. That's BS. That
Yeah.
we're going to encounter. We haven't historically and in the past, I think, recent past, but I think we're going to encounter a belligerent civilization hell bent on on you know the conquest of us and the earth at some point.
Yeah.
So but who do you trust? Do you trust the military industrial complex, who wants us constantly in a state of paranoid fear, or do you trust the people that, oh, it's all peaceful? And it's like, again, as I said earlier, an hour ago,
These are the
we're in a
deepest
society
questions, you know?
where, yeah, where everything is at the extremes now. It's got to be all the way this way or all the way that way.
Right. No, because we talked about like we are to some degree a fascist, you know, like that's just the way it is. I'm not saying it's
Yeah, we
great.
have fascist
I'm just
elements.
saying with that, you
Yeah.
know, a lot of what how we heroically view ourselves as this republic, it's 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 uh it's in need of dire help, you know? Like
Yeah.
we have to if we had control over our money and you know, COVID, that was just a few years ago.
Right.
Think of that as just an example of the encroachment of, you know, a totalitarian entity. And, you know, wherever you fell on that, it was like it was a test, a stress test
Yeah.
for, you know, whether, you know, and it was on this platform and, you know, that where if you were not allowed to question
Yeah.
the
That
election
was
on 2020, you couldn't question COVID. Even though
right.
now, like, you know, there's an you know, like an inspector general from the DOD that's like, well, okay, you know, even though all that's out there, you know, I would like to have like a mea culpa from again establishment bodies, what you know, newspapers, any prominent person like a Jimmy Kimmel or anybody that was maybe even getting royalties, but if we learn like this time later, like you know, that wasn't the best way to react to something,
Right.
you
Right.
know.
But again, it goes back to this. They're yanking us all the way left, all the way right, because they know that if you can be right, you can be left. Just it's smart to not stray too far from the middle, because when you get out too far from the middle, you're getting out on those ends, and that's where the totalitarian crazies are on both sides. And we're
Right.
experiencing that to extent now,
No, it's
just like we
true.
experienced it before, a few years ago. Now they want to swing. There's people that want to swing it too far to the right. And that's just keeping us going back and forth and at each other's throats and not knowing, where to land. And I think that's by design. Just keep us in
There's
this
a lot
state
of
of
things like
chaos.
social proof and things, you know,
Yeah.
I was talking to somebody in the Democrat world and they're like, "Oh, you want to run for some Democratic office or something. So how do you deal with the people within your party that are like on these different extremes? Like you have the like,
Yeah.
oh, we have to recognize trans people and this and that. And then you have to deal with people who are just, you know, I'm trying to bring some jobs back to my community. Like you know, you have some moderate position or something, but you have people who are just like, oh, we're not gonna like. You have these optics or things. Like one of the I think the mistakes that was made is this not only just going with it, but doubling down on things that you know half the country would be like, no, that's we're not cool with that at all. You know, let alone like trying to showcase it. So
Mm-hmm.
like this is the pendulum effect, right? So like you know when people are like, let's attack you know DEA, DI hires or whatever the
Yeah.
diversity, equity, inclusion,
Mm-hmm.
and but I'm still I'm fascinated that they ran somebody like Kamala, like or if we were being trolled because that woman.
Well, we don't know. I
You
mean,
know,
think
like,
about
could
it.
they? Did they have people who are like, you know, you should advocate for the declassification of the JFK files? Would that even be a thing on that side? Like, like you know, like newsflash, I'm not a Republican, but like there's no way in hell like I'd ever support, you know, like some of the crazy stuff that was on that Democratic Party.
We need a new way. We need a third way for those of
Yeah,
us who aren't either party. Because I mean, I'm a guy who's generally right of center, but I
yeah,
think for myself, and I have some values and some positions that are definitely a little left of center. And
right.
I've come to that through thinking for myself. And I don't like to see us yanked too far in
Well,
either
it's
direction.
not. It yanks us apart as a community, as family
Yeah.
members, as friends. Like you know, there's people that are like, oh, I can't talk to you now. Um, you know,
Like I have no problem
both
with
of
the
these
trans
parties get
people.
together and approve, you know, war and different things. You know, like do not misunderstand. That's the problem. So they're not, you know,
Right. Yeah.
Like,
it,
you
it
know,
it's all crazy. They want to keep us agitated, and because what's going to happen is if enough of us got together and said, hey, wait a minute, let's quit
oh,
fighting with ourselves and let's see who's really at fault for, things going wrong. They don't want that. They don't want us paying attention to that, because then they'll be in trouble. And when I was a federal agent, okay, I
yeah,
was a badge carrying federal agent for the United States Air Force, and on my desk I had that quote. I think it was Benjamin Franklin. I can't remember who, but I had this on my desk. That quote that says, when the people fear the government, there's tyranny.
yeah.
When the government fears the people, there is liberty. Now, as a federal agent and military officer, that quote was on my desk because that reminded me who I was really working for. I was working for the Constitution and the people, and protecting the Air Force from spies
Right.
trying to steal our technology. But I worked with federal agent guys that were more enamored of the authority they had, and they could crack heads on the people. And my view was, no, I'm supposed to crack heads on bad guys, and the people are the customer, so to speak. They're what it's all about. And it's
Well, with your experience in that world
mm-hmm.
and being an observer now at like all the what you witness happening in our country, like
Yeah.
what do you think are ways forward to reforming? Well, it's tough to even know what's going on, but whether it's the national security state, like how could we get to a place where that's reined in or under a constitutional control at the very least, so you don't have like a CIA policy and a White House policy.
Yeah.
Um, like
Well,
you know what I mean? Like that there's
yeah.
or things like
That's a
that.
that's a deep state issue, as they say, that goes back directly to Operation Paperclip, post World War II. I'll send you my book NIMSA. I tell all about it, and the historical information that backs it all up. We were taken over. We were invaded through Operation Paperclip. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was the coup by Joseph Farrell's Nazi International, or the group I call NIMSA. And we have been pushed increasingly towards different forms of fascism as the decades have gone,
Right.
but with Marxism being used as the other
Right.
side of
The
swinging us back and
dialectic,
forth.
yeah, it's the
Exactly.
cudgel. Like, well, I think of
Exactly. Because both are evil. I'm
I
sorry.
think of like I don't know if it was
Communism and
it might have
fascism
been
are
Ben
evil.
Shapiro and Elon Musk having a conversation, but they're like, "Oh my gosh, now that you've bought X back, it's so amazing that I could say like a woman is a woman or something." And I
Yeah.
thought that is such a false dialectic. Like freedom of
Yeah.
speech is very important, but
Well,
it's
they've
it
they've
ties.
spun up a
They
bunch
made
of
that like a
paranoia.
false thing. Like, aren't you
Yeah.
glad that now you could say like a woman? Like, I don't remember it. Like, it was a very trivial line that like you should be able to say anyway. It should never have been controversial in the first place. Like, there's only two sexes or something. Like and they
Well,
thought, isn't that crazy?
the trans people they constitute less than 1%
Oh,
of the population. What's the obsession these people are having with
very good point.
eradicating them?
Very good point.
Come on. Personally, if you look at psychology, I think what it is the loudest voices are trying to deal with an attraction that they can't deal with.
Do you want me to give you a really cynical version?
Yeah.
Depopulation. Like,
Oh, they see it as a
we cannot
depopulation.
have the proletariats having sex or making babies, and then we already
Oh,
have it. Well, look at the births, the birth rates. Elon
yeah.
Musk is
Going
talking
down.
about
Yeah.
this. Like, Korea is like in danger of like they've got one of the lowest, but across the West, if you believe that that was one way of achieving power, of achieving goals over a long time, and that was the last book that Jim Marrs wrote, by the way, it was depopulation. What was COVID? What are all these other things?
Yeah.
I'm not saying I embrace or endorse that. I'm just saying, do you want a cynical, like
Yeah.
super
No, I
cynical,
hear
like
you. Yeah.
scary, super scary version?
And
But
there are these scary things. They are using science and technology against us.
I'd call it
But
slow kill. Like if
but
like
I don't believe in throwing the babies out with the bathwater. Like some people say, "Oh, there's this bad thing about technology, so it's all
yeah,
bad." Yeah, it's like, no, 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 no.
no, no,
Learn to discern. Identify what's bad, Um,
And if you don't have the ability to look at what's beautiful and optimistic in life, you won't have something worth fighting for, right?
that's
You
right.
you are fighting for your values, not because you hate somebody else so much. You want to
Yeah.
survive. Ideally,
Yeah.
like no one should ever fight,
And
but
don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Isn't that the phrase?
that's what she said, but I was still uncomfortable afterwards.
Well, heck, we've come to an hour, James.
Well,
We're gonna have to do this again.
yeah, absolutely. Next time I'll be a wizard and I'll be able to play clips or whatnot. But for ad hoc and having a good discussion, like you're the best.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
And
It's great talking with you, and I can't wait to get into some more things that we've talked about off camera, already in the past. So we've got a lot more conversations to come, I think. So
absolutely.
thank you for. Where can folks find you? And
I wish not to be found. I'm hiding out in West Virginia. Now, West
okay,
Virginia, what if there's something really secret in West Virginia, And what if Keel was hired by the government to like write this thing that distracts people? Just like, I don't know, make it about a moth or something. And so there's this deep underground base that no one ever looks into.
well, I think we're talking about the lost Vedic civilization that has something to do with what Keel wrote about and what Woody Dernberger encountered, because Indrid Cold, I think, has more to do with that than he does this ridiculous Indrid Cold that's the smiling man, and they make him look demonic and like something out of a horror movie, and that's not how Woody described him at all. And so, yeah, I
Well,
think
listen,
something going on
at
there.
Liquid Logic on Rumble, I have a little baby channel I've started to talk about things. Walter was my last
Good.
guest. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Captain James West on the X platform, just a handle that happened. And yeah, I've been doing this little podcast called Unwitting Assets, and it's just a fun way to talk about national. Like my one of the things I care about is reform of the national security state because I believe a lot of the reforms that everybody else wants to get to can't be gotten to until that entity as an elephant in the room is
Mhm.
acknowledged,
Right.
discussed. There's a constitutional ruling on it, whatever it is, a peace and reconciliation process. But like we just need some transparency, some sunlight,
Yep.
and to put the power back into the people. So it's okay to have secrecy in an appropriate way, but not something that is abused. Because
Exactly.
our very epistemology and the way we understand our world, ourselves, is at risk. So, like,
Yes.
if people are even doubting, um, the whether there are two sexes, like on that cultural level, or there's important things about our very history, like maybe it's what happened to JFK, MLK. Or maybe it's just the history. When we know the true history, we have a true knowledge base, and we can make good, actionable, based on that actionable intelligence, we can make good decisions for the future. If we don't know our true history, we can be manipulated
Yes.
forever.
Yes. That's true.
So
That's
that's the
true.
idea, just to have conversations with people like you and others that like we all want to have a good time but we want to exercise a civic duty and then educate, spread the knowledge of what we've learned
Yep.
to keep people just savvy as to what's going on.
There you go. There you go. We'll have you back and we'll do this again and do that. And thanks again, James.
God
Appreciate it.
bless, brother.